For this project, I used several more planks from my hoard of walnut. The big stacks are getting smaller, but that's what the wood is for. This project is all about countertops in the kitchen. We're upgrading some cabinets, and I'm making new countertops for 2 of them, along with a couple of shelves on the wall above them. The counters will be a bold presence in the house, and they called for some very special wood. I'm going to make everything from solid Claro Walnut, a beautiful wood that will turn these ordinary counters into exceptional showpieces. One countertop will be our coffee bar, servicing all of our prodigious caffeine needs. It will be a relatively simple rectangle of wood, so that's why I'm tackling it first. I'll show the process in this video, along with the fascinating story of where this wonderful wood came from. The coffee bar is 2 feet deep and 5 feet long. It's 1 3/4 of an inch thick, or at least that's how it appears. To conserve wood, I'm playing a little trick by making the edges thicker than the center. It makes things a little more complicated to build, but this Claro walnut is too special to waste. You can't buy wood like this at the home improvement center. Hell, you can't buy it at the wholesalers who sell to professional cabinet makers. Only a few dealers who specialize in exotic slabs of wood have it, and they'll charge a fortune for it. But we were lucky enough to come to own an entire tree full of it. The coffee bar is just a simple rectangle of wood, except that no assembly of solid wood is ever really simple. Over the years, hardwood will cup and curl and split with use and abuse and the ever-changing atmospheric conditions. In order to keep this top flat and solid, I added breadboard ends. As the name implies, these boards are attached across the ends of the planks that make up the central field and are aligned with their grain at right angles. This has the effect of holding the planks flat and keeping them from cupping and warping. They also conveniently cover up the end grain with the more attractive side grain. All of my boards have wild edges that follow the outside bark of the tree and are difficult to trim in a straight line. It's possible, but difficult to do it on a table saw. You have to make a special jig, and the bigger the piece of wood, the more fraught the operation becomes. A track saw is the perfect tool for straightening wild edges because the track is its own reference line. There's a current trend in woodworking to incorporate those wild edges in furniture, and I've made several pieces that do just that. But it's an aesthetic style choice, and it would not have looked right on these more functional countertops. Later this year, I hope to make a big dining table from this Claro walnut, and it will have a wild, natural waney edge on both sides. Stay tuned for the video of that project. first task was to make the central part of the countertop, which I called a field. It consists of 3 planks with attractive grain patterns. I ripped and then rough planed a few boards just to see what I had to work with. Then I selected the best looking ones. It took a few tries to get them arranged harmoniously, and when I was done, I marked them with chalk and proceeded to glue them together. It's difficult to keep the vertical alignment straight when edge gluing planks, so I use the Festool Domino cutter to keep the top faces of the planks flush with each other. The Domino is Festool's proprietary biscuit system. Essentially, dominoes are floating tenons made from beechwood, and like everything Festool makes, they're flawless. The central field of boards are all 1 inch thick, while the 2 long sides and the 2 transverse breadboard ends are all 1 3/4 inches thick. That means that from the outside it looks thick, but I'm saving lots of wood that would otherwise just be hidden. Most of my planks are too thin to make these thicker edge boards, so I'm laminating them up out of 2 pieces of thinner wood. There's a lot of work involved in selecting and milling the right boards. planks have been drying in the west shed for almost 6 years now, so there's some warping that's only to be expected. But they are also dirty and dusty and don't look like much at all. That is, until you run them through the planer and see the newly exposed figure and coloration. In 2011, my wife Sue and I purchased a 50-acre former dairy ranch in the hilly cow country west of Petaluma, about an hour north of San Francisco. The ranch was beautiful, but in very rough shape. Just for fun, we named it Monkey Ranch. In front of the old farmhouse was a very old black walnut tree. I estimated the tree to be the same age as our house, which was originally built in 1879. This black walnut was a remarkable specimen, short, fat, and ailing, but holding the promise of fantastic riches within. I had the tree inspected by an arborist, and he confirmed that it was slowly dying, with a severely damaged crown, significant internal rot, and no viable future. The black walnut tree is native to California and can commonly be found in low-lying ground near creeks or streams, which kind of describes Monkey Ranch. Every autumn, the squirrels go crazy, collecting the fallen nuts and storing them away for winter. Of course, the silly squirrels forget where they stashed most of their walnuts, and that's one reason why wild walnut trees spring up in unexpected places around the ranch. All of these trees are of the species Juglans californica, a medium-sized tree whose trunk rarely exceeds 12 inches in diameter. This one special tree in front of the farmhouse was bigger and different. That's because it's the much rarer species Juglans heinzii, called by woodworkers Claro Walnut. Heinzii grows much larger than californica. This one was magnificent, with the main portion of the trunk 40 inches in diameter and the top and bottom approaching 4 full feet across. Claro walnut is a rare and expensive wood prized by furniture makers. It's often used to trim out private jets, super luxury autos, executive boardrooms, custom guitars and banjos, and for making the stocks of the finest hunting rifles. Its grain is often highly figured and multicolored, with lovely curvy streaks of silver, purple, and yellow, accentuating its rich chocolate brown. The indigenous people of California ate the black walnuts, but today we only eat the larger and tastier fruit of the Persian walnut tree, often called the English walnut. This is yet another species, Juglans regia, but regia is almost universally grafted onto the hardier black walnut rootstock. Usually, like most fruit trees, the graft is down low, close to the ground. But this particular tree had been grafted 15 feet above the ground level. Now, there's no practical reason for putting a graft up so high, unless, of course, you are thinking ahead, far ahead. I like to believe the original rancher who planted it did so in full knowledge that someone, someday, would cut it down and make furniture with the trunk. And in the meantime, he could spend his life eating tasty English walnuts. Some long time before we bought the ranch, and for reasons unknown, that graft had failed. So the tree was comically misshapen, without a proper crown, and no branches to speak of, just a spherical explosion of desperate, skinny little suckers. The tree was ready for harvesting. In March of 2014, we very carefully took the old walnut tree down. First, we dug around the base of the tree and severed the largest roots. Then we gently pulled it down with a tractor.
Yeah, there it is. Beautiful.
We were able to extract the root ball along with about 14 feet of the trunk. I hired a local sawyer, Sean Gavin, to cut up the tree. I really liked working with Sean. He had a great respect for wood and a deep knowledge of trees, saws, and milling. He understood that I didn't just want some tree cut up for construction planks, but I wanted my very special tree turned into the stuff of heirlooms. And above all, he was patient. He spent quite a bit of time just studying the fallen trunk and was reluctant to cut into it until he was confident that he could cut it correctly. Initially, he severed the root ball. This lump of subterranean wood couldn't really be treated as part of the trunk, mostly because of its girth, but also because its wood is different from the above-ground portion. With the root ball pulled off to one side, we could address the meat of the tree. Looking at the cut end of a tree, you can see its concentric growth rings. The very center of the innermost growth ring is called the pith. We want the very first cut through the log to follow right along the pith from one end to the other. We want to sacrifice the unusable pith to maximize our yield of good wood. The problem with this, of course, is knowing where the pith meanders through the tree before you cut it open. A good sawyer, and Sean is a very good sawyer, can imagine exactly where the pith is long before he cuts into the log. Once Sean had the root ball moved aside, he could assess the trunk from both ends, and after studying it for most of an hour, he had sufficient confidence he could find the path of the pith through the trunk with his chainsaw. Sean made the critical first cut with his Alaskan chainsaw mill. This contraption uses a powerful chainsaw with a long blade suspended in a framework that slides along a straight edge temporarily nailed into the tree. Sean's portable bandsaw mill has a 42-inch capacity, which is big, but not big enough for this tree, so he made the first 4 cuts with the Alaska mill. He actually cut through the pith on the 3rd cut, using the first 2 to liberate 2 giant 4-inch thick slabs, with at least one of them destined to become a showpiece dining table. The 4th cut was vertical, dividing the lower half of the tree into 2 quarters that we then loaded onto the bandsaw and ripped into planks. It took 2.5 days of hard work to break down the tree, then more time removing the bark, treating the wood with an anti-termite spray, then stacking it in the shed adjacent to my workshop. When we finally hung up our gloves, we had almost 1,000 board feet of it air drying in the shed next to my workshop. After 6 years of drying out, the rough-cut planks appear very unpromising, being dirty, dusty, and somewhat warped. If you found a chunk of it laying around, you'd toss it into the fireplace without a second thought. But run a plank through the planer, and it reveals the beauty hiding within. The wood near the bottom of the trunk is a deep chocolate brown with fairly straight grain, the perfect wood for table legs. The wood farther up the trunk shows what's called reaction wood. that is, wood that grew to help stabilize the tree when it was under stress. Reaction wood has what woodworkers call figure, or grain that runs in more interesting ways than just straight. In the commercial world of construction lumber, mills and sawyers hate figure. It's hard to cut, it warps, it's difficult to plane smooth, and it generally doesn't come in the big pieces that builders want. But furniture makers love the stuff. All that curvy figured grain gives the wood interest and beauty. If this was a conventional plywood countertop, you could just screw it to the cabinet carcass. But with solid wood, that's a recipe for disaster. The wood expands and contracts with atmospheric moisture, and it needs room to move. If it's not given that room, it will break something. Either the wood will split, or it will break whatever it is trying to hold it in a fixed position. The forces at work are stronger than screws, nails, or glue. To hold the countertop down, I used wooden clips that hook into grooves underneath the top and are then screwed to the carcass. The hooks let the top move slightly while still keeping a strong grip on it. I made the wooden clips out of a scrap of oak. To make the matching groove in the countertop, I used the router table and a straight cutting bit. The breadboard ends attach to the field in much the same way as the long side rails do, except for the glue. It's an ancient joiner's trick. Although I put dominoes all the way across, I didn't put glue on the entire joint. The purpose of the breadboard end is to restrict vertical movement of the boards in the field, but because of the differential rates of expansion and contraction, the field has to be able to move horizontally. The domino slots are cut a little wider than normal, so the dominoes are free to move side to side, and all of the expansion and contraction will take place on the unglued side, which is the side up against the wall, and the front will stay smooth when you touch it with your fingers. After all the boards were glued up, it was time to pay attention to the details. I used a big old firmer chisel to remove the bigger lumps of dried, squeezed out glue, but it was the card scraper that did the lion's share of the cleanup work. This simple tool attacks the surface of the wood at such a high angle that it can smooth out the most cantankerous grain that would confound even a high-angle smoothing plane. All of the power tools leave their traces on the wood, and the scraper is the best tool for removing them. The circular saws leave burn marks, and the planer leaves tiny little grooves made by its drive roller. The scraper takes them all out much faster and better than sanding does. The corners of my countertop can feel uncomfortably sharp, so I chamfer them by running my block plane along them at 45 degrees. Chamfers are one of those tiny details that can really dress up a piece. Sanding the entire top is the next step. The random orbit sander both vibrates and rotates while sucking up all of the fine dust particles through holes in the sanding disc. I start with 100, a pretty coarse grit. That's the one that does all the real work. Then I work my way up with 120, 180, and then 220 grit. Each successively finer grit just removes the tiny scratches from the previous coarser grit. Finally, it's into the paint room for varnishing. I'm using an oil-based polyurethane varnish, thinned about 50-50 with mineral spirits. I like to brush on the first coat or two. There's no need to be neat or smooth. You just slather it on thick. Then after a few minutes, you wipe off all the excess. The raw wood really soaks up the varnish. Subsequent coats are done the same way, but they're much thinner after wiping them off, so I switch to spraying. Spray coats are quicker, so they take longer to dry, but they go on nice and smooth and build up a thicker, more protective finish. Even though I have a special paint room with a roof-mounted exhaust blower and filtered air intake, wood shops are inherently very dusty. Without a paint room, I'd have to sand thoroughly between every coat simply because dust will settle on the sticky varnish. Because I have the luxury of painting in a relatively dust-free environment, I can get away with a simple burnishing at the end. I crumple up a wad of craft paper and rub it gently across the surface. It knocks the little dust nibs right off and makes the surface feel smooth to the touch. For the most part, our kitchen style is Danish modern, with straight rectilinear lines and muted tones of gray and off-white. This little nook for preparing coffee and drinks is somewhat separate both in purpose and placement, so we wanted it to look different too. The bold coloration and wild figure of the Claro Walnut gives us just the accent we were looking for. Stay tuned for more videos on this project. Thanks for watching.